Oh my word, there are so many reasons to love word dies. Here's 12. First, you can stack them up. All you need is 3 or 4 of the same die cut to add some dimension and a really sturdy sentiment. And you can use that stack to make an eclipse card. The idea behind an eclipse card is to cut the sentiment from the panel, stack it up, and the dimension alone gives the word some legibility. But there's lots of ways to customize it. I took the background panel and ran it through my die cutting machine with a 3D embossing folder from Altenew. Then, instead of just stacking them up, I first added color to them by swiping my ink pads on the words. This will add some color to the sides of the stack and provide even more definition to my sentiment. To make sure that the edges of each die cut got some color, I pressed the ink pad onto both the front and the back of each piece word in Party Dress, Orange Twist, Drive-In, and Serenade. To add some sparkle, I just laid the white piece back into the background and I splattered some silvery metallic watercolor with an aqua brush. You need to add a lot of water to the pans to get a consistency that will splatter easily, and an aqua brush has the water built right in. I learned this little trick from my friend Amy recently, and it's made it such an easier process. I added the embossed background and a plain white piece right onto the white card base. This means that all 4 of my colored layers will be above the white background panel instead of one of them fitting into the hole, and that will give me a little more color and more chunkiness. I used liquid glue to stack up my 4 layers, and I put an acrylic block over the stack as I added glue to the next layer. This font is pretty easy to line up. There's no fiddly little ends that seem to somehow move on their own when you try to do this. I added the splattered white piece to the top of my little stack, and now it's time to glue the whole thing onto my card. You can see that the color is there. It's subtle, but it's there, and that's helping my white words stand out on my white background. Of course, you could just use white for an even more subtle look, or you could use black, or you could use craft foam. I've got so many strips of white cardstock scraps that this is the easiest way for me to do it. You can also add color to your word die cuts. As I said, I have lots of white scraps, and whenever I die cut something for a card, I try to remember to also cut some extra words to keep on hand for future cards. I keep all these so-called extras in a box, and I generally cut them from white and a few in black. Having white die cuts allows me to customize them for the color scheme of any card I'm making, and in this case, I'm using a blending brush to blend my 4 inks onto this large hello die from Waffle flower. I'm going in heavy at the bottom and letting the pressure up as I move to the right to let the color fade out. And again, I added a little splatter. Splatter is one of the best ways to hide an imperfect blend, but even if your blend is perfect, a little sparkle is always welcome. So this die cut could be used on its own, just like this, but it also comes with a shadow die. This is a solid die cut that's just slightly larger than the word, and it adds a nice border. This is a great way to make your sentiment stand out if you have it on a busy background. But what if you don't have a shadow die? Just cut the word again in a contrasting color and stack them up, but slightly offset. Or offset a lot, whatever gives you the look you're going for. Now I'm using the shadow this time, so I'll stick that extra black hello word back into my plastic pocket that I keep my extras in. Now here's another option if you have a word die with a shadow. This one works best if the shadow is quite a bit larger than the word, but you can make it work with any word die with a shadow. I've added some color to the shadow of this die, which is a Merry Christmas die from Pink and Maine. And next I just cut the word from the shadow itself, as well as from some white cardstock. I removed the colored words from the shadow and then placed the white words into the hole. I added some tape on the back to hold it all together, and you could use another layer of the shadow if you wanted, which would add some dimension. To get the little letter centers back into the correct holes, I just lay the colored words over top of the white ones, and I use my poker tool to push them down into the holes. Because there's tape behind, they'll stick. Here's another option if you have a word die with no shadow. As I said, you may want a border to help your sentiment stand out from a busy background. And this Merry Christmas is one of my current favorites. When I need a shadow for it, one option is to glue it to a piece of contrasting cardstock and then fussy cut around it. Try to keep the border somewhat even around it, and when there's little bumps from the letters, don't worry about accuracy, just kind of wiggle your scissors a little, and no one will be able to tell that they don't actually match up. If you're like me and you don't like fussy cutting, I've used a circle behind a die cut sentiment as a kind of shadow. It performs the same function without requiring any fussy cutting. Depending on the overall shape of your word die, maybe an oval, a square, or rectangle would work as well. Now here's a fun one. Build a background with your word dies. I've got these thin words from Tim Holtz, and they do cut very tiny, narrow letters, but I actually prefer the look of the negative words they create. I start with colored strips of cardstock and line up my dies on them. I happen to know that half-inch strips are perfect for these words. Then I just cut a whole bunch. Each strip gave me 1 holidays and 2 happies. To place them on my card panel, I used my MISTI and one of the Creative Corner tools to get a straight line before gluing down my first line of words. I want a kind of continuous block, so I've got these ones going off the edges, but I made sure that I had a full happy and a full holidays in the block so that the sentiment is actually legible. Another fun way to build a background would be to use one or several word die cuts and glue them directly onto a panel, sort of a faux embossed look. This is especially effective when it's a tone-on-tone design. These little Christmas word dies have shadows that are tags. If you don't want to make a tag, use your scissors and just trim off the hole in the end to create a perfect shadow. And we can take it a step further and customize a word die by trimming off one letter from the end. Let's say you've got a thanks die, but you want to make a card that says thank you. If you're nervous, take a pencil and draw right on the die cut where you think the letter K would end. Then use a pair of sharp scissors and trim it down. If your die has a shadow, like this one, put your shortened word onto the shadow and draw around the edge of the last letter so that you can trim it as well. To finish my sentiment, I'm going to use only the U part of this thank you die cut and save the thank part for another card. My mixing and matching gives me a sentiment that's unique and more what I was looking for. I colored the thank you word, attached it to its shadow, and then positioned the U over top. To support the narrow lines of that little word, I just cut another one, trimmed it down, and added the other layer of black just behind the parts of the word that were hanging over. And now for the big finish. You can use word dies to create shaker cards. I don't make shaker cards very often, and there's one point where I always get stuck. So here's a lesson in making shakers for real people. I blended my colors onto a panel, added some splatter, and set that aside to dry. That's going to be the panel behind my shaker. Next, I cut the oversized joy die from a panel of white cardstock. I cut both the shadow and the word at the same time, so now I have an inlaid joy similar to what I was doing back with that Pink and Main Merry Christmas. First, I'm going to add some acetate to the back of the white panel. I used liquid glue and I put it all around the edge of the word, right up in that little bit between the J and the Y, because I don't want it flopping around. Now I've got the shadow bit, which could actually be a pretty cool sentiment on its own, so I'll hold on to that in my pocket for a future card. But for this card, I just want the actual word. Given where the word will be over that blended panel, I figured I should use my darkest color for best visibility, but you'll see in the end that I changed my mind and added a black layer over top. Next came a whole lot of foam tape. You really want to double up on the foam tape to give your shaker bits room to move freely. And you want to limit the space where the shaker bits can go, so it's good to have the tape as close to the edge of the letters as possible without showing from the front of the card. Take your time, cut your tape into triangles, and don't forget to continue the doubled up tape to the edges of the panel so that it will be fully supported and not have any saggy bits. Okay, now here's the bit that always gets me. Because of the shape of the word, I'm not exactly sure where to put the sequins onto the panel. But if I put the sequins into the front of the card, how will I know where to put the card over top so that it's centered properly? See what I mean? I spent an embarrassing amount of time trying to build up the courage to put the card down onto the shaker, but then I came up with a better solution. I peeled the blended panel off the card base and I used a rectangle die to cut a piece from the center of it. Then I used the smaller rectangle to close up the shaker, and I used the outer portion as a frame directly on the base of the card. Then I just glued the shaker onto the card, and no one will ever know that the blended panel isn't one piece. Sometimes I think card making is like magic. There's often a little bit of illusion going on, isn't there? And there's even more. I could keep going and going. And then there's alphabet dies. There's even more possibilities that you can learn about right here. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.